Sometimes some of the most complicating technologies are actually quite simple, and I think that's the case with Kerberos constrained delegation. When we look at this exam objective, we think, wow, this has got to be something super complicated, but it's really not. In fact, the configuration that we're going to walk through together in this hands-on lab is quite simple. It's really, the trick here would be understanding exactly why and what this technology is doing for us. So let's make sure you can master the tricky part of this, what Kerberos constrained delegation is all about. Let's say right here we have a World Wide Web server. We know if we're using the built-in services that we could have with Windows Server 2016, this would be an IIS server. But of course, web servers often need to access databases. So let's say we have this SQL Server system over here that's providing the data that that web server serves up to customers. So here we have a user coming in and they hit the IIS box, and of course they are using their user's credentials in order to make that access. But the problem could be that when our World Wide Web server goes to hit the SQL server, it uses its service account in order to make that access. And that could be a problem. What if we want the user credentials to be passed to the SQL server? Well, we need Kerberos delegation in order for this to take place. And notice there's this constrained delegation because we may want this impersonation of this user account by this IIS web server to only take place for certain services. If we don't care, we would do what's called unconstrained delegation. But if we do want it limited to just certain services, then we engage in what you and I are going to do together, and that is the configuration of constrained delegation. So let's jump into our hands-on lab and see just how easy this would be to configure. We're going to go to our DCNUG1 machine, and once we're in DCNUG1, let's jump into Server Manager and let's launch the Active Directory Users and Computers tool. Inside of the Active Directory Users and Computers, we want to head to the properties of the machine that we want to configure the constrained delegation on. That's going to be our own DCNUG1 machine. So let's jump into Users and Computers, as I said, and then inside of there, let's open, how about domain controllers in order to see our local system. By no means is this a domain controller restricted feature, by the way. We can do this on the various member servers that are participating inside of our domain as well. But anyways, let's double click DCNUG1, and sure enough, there's this delegation tab where we configure Kerberos delegation. Notice we could go in and undo the default and say, do not trust this computer for delegation. So we have the ability to really stop this impersonation of user account behavior that we can do. Notice the default is to trust this computer for delegation to any service. So the default behavior is to use Kerberos delegation for any service at all. The constrained delegation comes in when we say we want to trust this computer for delegation to specified services only. Notice we could even use alternate authentication protocols. Any of them would be acceptable. But of course, we typically stick to Kerberos only, and we're going to go in at this point and add those explicit services on explicit systems where we want the Kerberos delegation to take place. So a very simple config. In our example, we'll go into Users and Computers, we'll type app, and then do a check name. We see our app NUG that's also in this lab. We say OK, and then we would choose the particular service on app NUG where we want this delegation to take place. Let's say it's the World Wide Web service. So now when this system goes to communicate with the World Wide Web service on app NUG, it can do that Kerberos delegation, the impersonation of those user account credentials passed over to the service on that other system. So in this nugget, you and I discussed first what Kerberos constrained delegation is all about, and then the much easier part, how simple that's going to be to configure inside of the graphical user interface inside of our Active Directory Users and Computers. I hope you found this nugget informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.